Hi, my name is Ben. I'm a co-founder and the CTO of Mastery Portfolio. This video is the third video in a series on setting up your account at themasterybook.com. Before this, I talked about mastery levels and telling a student narrative on learning. This video is all about organizing learning, or really it's about the standards section in the Manage tab. I highly recommend if you haven't watched the previous tutorials, you watch those first. Before we begin, I want to be clear on what we mean when we say standards. Standards is an overarching term for what could be split up into a number of things. Some schools might call it competencies, other schools might call it objectives. Whatever you call it at your school, the Mastery Book has ways of customizing the labels so that the language aligns with the vocabulary that you prefer. However, we always use the word standards to mean any number of things. I just want to be clear about that because we're about to jump into the standards tab. Let's go ahead and take a look at that now. The question we're endeavoring to answer is how do you identify student learning? And if the last two videos were about what that looks like using mastery levels, this video is going to be about how it's organized using standards. Now, before we take a look at the standards section of the Manage tab, I want to be very clear about something. Everything I've shown you so far, I've tried to use very generic examples because the whole idea is that this is customized for your school. It is not my intention to provide you with a template that you should copy verbatim, and that's especially true in how you organize your standards. So I'm going to be using extremely generic names in order to help encourage you to come up with ones that are specific for your teaching environment. Anyway, let's go into standards, and there are two ways to upload standards: a manual upload or a CSV upload. Let's take a look very briefly at the CSV upload. If you click on it, there is a guide on how the CSV can be formatted. All of these terms here I'm going to discuss in the video as we do a manual upload. I just want you to know that you do not have to upload every single standard manually, and in many cases a CSV upload is going to save you a lot of time. However, it'll be a lot easier to understand what's going on if we do a manual upload. Furthermore, there's also a standards wizard that you can enter. So if you click this, it'll show you some recommended content standards which you can use, and this is definitely going to be a section of the web app that's going to develop with time. For now, I'm not going to import any of the Common Core standards. Those are the ones that are currently available. I'm just going to click Save and Finish in order to go back to the Standards tab. Now, the big idea is that standards are organized in hierarchies, and at the top level of a hierarchy is a standards category. In introducing this concept to you, I think the best way to go about it is to just jump right in, to start to build an example, and then once we have a few things created, we can really talk about the structure and what's really going on here. So I'm going to just immediately begin creating some standards, beginning with categories. So I'm going to do 3 categories, one right after the other. The first category is going to be called Discipline-Specific Standards. And I'm going to check the box that says this is a category. Right now, I'm going to ignore these other fields. We'll talk about what they mean after I've set up a few categories. By the way, the naming that I'm using here, I'm trying to be very generic. It's just for an example. If you would like to name yours exactly the same as mine, you can change it later. I'm going to click Save. And when I do, you can see there's a new section that's created, School-Wide, and there's one category underneath School-Wide, Discipline-Specific Standards. I'm going to create another standard, and this one's going to be called transdisciplinary. And by this, I mean any standards that would apply to any content area, and it's another category. So I'll click that category box, and I'll click Save again. And then I'll do one more category, and this one's going to be called unweighted standards. It's another category. Save. Okay, so these are the three categories that I would say I recommend for organization in your school. Discipline-specific standards relate to the content that's being taught in each class. Transdisciplinary standards relate to the kinds of performance standards that students would use in any class. And then finally, unweighted standards would be things that we want to assess about a student but don't have an impact on the student's learning. For example, timeliness and participation. Now, each of these is a category, which means we would never actually score this on a student. These are just generic titles. We're going to break down further into a deeper and deeper standards tree. So let's go into discipline-specific standards. And I'll create a new standard. And this is another category. I'll call it math. It's a category. And then down below, I'm going to say that this math category has a parent standard. And the parent that it has is discipline-specific standards. And when I do this, you'll see that this creates a drop-down. So now I have a math category for standards. If I create another standard, I might call it English. And it's another category that breaks off of discipline-specific standards. So there's another one here. Let's do another one. Science, a category that breaks off of discipline-specific standards. What I'm trying to do here is create a hierarchy of standards that represents how I want to reflect student learning. So I want to categorize their progress in different content areas according to English, math, science, and maybe more. I'm not going to make more categories for now. I hope this gets the point across. Underneath these categories, I might even want to have subcategories. So for example, in math, I might create an algebra category. Now, I used to teach high school math. That's why I'm going in this direction. Linked to math. And again, we have another branch of our tree. And then finally, underneath this subcategory, I might have a specific standard that I actually use in a class setting. So we'll do one more standard. Now this is going to be a standard that actually appears on an assignment. So I'll use an example. We'll say solve linear equations. I just want to use a very short example. Now, often it's the case that standards have abbreviations. So this one is an algebra standard, and maybe it's the first category or something. So A1 is the abbreviation. This is not a very descriptive abbreviation, but it's pretty common for things like Common Core standards, or it might be very common at your state level. Note that because I'm actually going to score this on assignments, I'm not going to check that this is a category. And I'm going to say that it is a child standard of algebra. We'll say save. Okay. So what this means is, in the discipline-specific standards, there's a math category. A subcategory of that is called algebra. And one of the standards that I assess students on is solving linear equations. The way I have this set up, algebra is not a standard that gets scored. It's only a category, as indicated here. Algebra 1 is a standard that gets assessed because it's not a category. So what does this box here mean? Learning target. Well, there's a little help box here. It says you can mark a standard as a learning target if you'd like to indicate is intended for a single lesson and you'd like it to show up when filtering for learning targets. Really, learning targets offer a way for teachers to customize standards as they're delivering instruction or for an individual day. So maybe solving linear equations is something that needs to break down into even more specific standards. So for example, maybe on Monday, you learn how to identify a y-intercept and subtract it from both sides of an equation. And maybe on Tuesday, you learn to identify with different types of coefficients. I want to be careful not to get too deep into content for my example here, but the whole point is there may be multiple steps to solving linear equations, and each of those steps is addressed on an individual day of the week to culminate with an assessment where solving linear equations is ultimately evaluated. So this might be the end goal, and what you want to do is break it down into individual learning targets for day by day. Selecting this option is what makes that a possibility, and it also appears on filters when you are using the MasteryBook. This next checkbox is called Mastery Exclusion, and that's what we mean when we say unweighted standards. Anything checked here is not going to be weighted, and I'm going to move to that example next. For parent standards, this is just indicating where it is in the tree, and for child standards, it tells you which standards are children of that branch. I'm not going to save changes. So for example, if I click on algebra, one of the child standards is A1. You can see that represented here, and then the parent standard is math. So that's what these two fields are for. Let's take a look now at when you might use mastery exclusion. I'm going to go into unweighted standards. Now, in the previous video, I discussed why you would use a narrative to describe when students have late work or are not participating in class. These are the types of behaviors that are important, but they don't represent how the student is learning, only how the student is participating towards their learning. So we want to distinguish between classroom behaviors and learning progress. And we encourage schools to do that using unweighted standards. So as an example, I might make a new standard, and we'll just call this timeliness. Now, for the description field, we'll say the student shows up to class on time and submits completed work on time. All right. I'm going to mark this as mastery exclusion, and it is branched off of unweighted standards. We'll click Save. So now I have standards that are grouped in this category, and this whole hierarchy is just a way to organize it. When we say unweighted, that simply means that whenever you are generating a report, or whenever you're generating the student's mastery ratio or mastery rating, anything that's talking about the student's scores, this isn't going to appear there, but you're still going to see the student performance on any lists of their achievement levels, or especially in the late assignments or missing assignments module in the reports tab. So even though we've discussed what all of these fields mean, I do want to provide one more example using transdisciplinary standards. At Mastery Portfolio, we really do advise schools to elaborate on the picture of student learning. In more traditional report cards and traditional grade settings, we tend to only grade students on content. But what we'd like to do is be able to give a report that just talks about the student's development of critical reasoning, or the ability to form an argument, or the ability to interpret texts. These are all things that would apply no matter what class you're in. So make a category for it so that when you generate a report, you can get a more detailed picture of how students are performing. Now, of course, you might be thinking, in order to add standards for all of the content areas and to get into so many categories, this is going to take forever to type it all out, but you may already have this at your school in some other format, like a CSV. Or if you're using state standards, you may be able to download it from the internet. So if you have access to a document like that, you can use the CSV upload tool. You may need to make some changes to the formatting. It does require each of these fields with a check mark on it. Now, the last piece here is this custom group. And we didn't talk about this yet because it's only for specific classes. But you will notice it inside of the hierarchy. There's school-wide standards, and then there are custom standards. I'll show you what appears here once we set up some classes. And so what we've done is we've created a branch that we can use for organizing student learning and giving us a richer picture whenever we generate reports for students. In the next video, we'll take a look at what this actually looks like when you're creating an assignment for a class, because the last video of this tutorial is going to be setting up your members and your classes.